Advanced species with technology far beyond humanity's found their advantages meaningless. Energy shields were bypassed by biological projectiles that adapted to frequency modulation. Automated defenses were overwhelmed by tactics that changed faster than AI could process. The Velian homeworld fell in 14 hours despite having orbital defenses that could withstand supernova-level events. Their mistake was preparing for logical opponents, not biological entities operating on pure consumption algorithms. The Kreks represented evolutionary perfection in predation. Single-minded purpose, infinite adaptability, and exponential reproduction made them unstoppable through conventional means. They didn't conquer to rule or acquire territory. They consumed to grow, and they grew to consume more. Every defeated civilization became fuel for the next invasion, creating an expanding wave of destruction that learned from each engagement. Galactic strategists finally understood the fundamental truth their peaceful evolution had obscured. Some threats cannot be reasoned with, compromised with, or appeased. The Kreks didn't want surrender, tribute, or territory. They wanted biomass, and every living thing in the galaxy represented potential fuel. This realization changed the nature of the conflict from war to survival. The rules of civilized engagement became irrelevant against an enemy that followed no rules except consumption. Defense plans based on containment, negotiation, or deterrence were scrapped. The Kreks didn't respond to shows of force or diplomatic offers. They responded only to being destroyed, and even then their remains often contained spores that would regenerate unless completely incinerated. The galaxy faced an enemy that could only be stopped through absolute annihilation, a concept most species found morally unthinkable until they witnessed entire worlds reduced to barren rock. What made the Kreks terrifying wasn't their technology or numbers, it was their biological imperative. They were the perfect predator in a galaxy that had forgotten what predators were. Their existence forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes survival requires embracing methods civilization had worked millennia to move beyond. The lesson was clear. You cannot reason with a virus, you cannot negotiate with a natural disaster, and you cannot appeal to the mercy of something that has none. General Stone's war room glowed with the cold light of tactical displays. Red markers blinked across a star map of the Kepler system, each one representing a defense grid failure in real time. Officers monitored the collapse with clinical detachment, their faces lit by the flicker of dying civilizations. They'd seen this pattern before, not in alien invasion reports but in human history. The Kreks moved like ancient Mongol hordes or blitzkrieg divisions, exploiting weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. Humanity faced a clear choice: send medical teams and reconstruction aid as the galaxy expected, or deploy what actually worked against predators. The decision took less time than the Council's transmission had taken to arrive. Military strategists analyzed Kreks' movements not as blind biological imperative, but as learned behavior. Their adaptation patterns showed predictable responses to specific stimuli, like training data emerging from what appeared to be chaos. Research from Earth's own violent past provided the framework. Predator species could be countered by changing the fundamental rules of engagement. You didn't fight a shark in open water or a wolf in its own territory. You forced them into environments where their advantages became liabilities. The Kreks expected civilized opposition, honorable stands, fixed defenses, predictable tactics. They hadn't encountered an enemy that fought without rules. Human commanders reviewed the casualty reports from fallen worlds. Mercy would be worse than useless against the Kreks. Offering compassion to a force that understood only consumption would get more people killed. The response message contained no diplomatic pleasantries or expressions of sympathy. It listed deployment coordinates, arrival timelines, and logistical requirements for supporting 50,000 combat veterans. Earth's approach rejected galactic conventions entirely. While Council species debated ethics and proportionality, human strategists calculated kill ratios and ammunition expenditure. They determined the minimum force required to achieve maximum disruption, then doubled it. Their planning assumed no surrender, no negotiation, no quarter given or expected. The Kreks would be treated not as opponents to be defeated, but as a disease to be eradicated. The transmission ended with a final line that would become legendary across the galaxy. No promises of salvation, no pledges of protection, just 7 words that represented humanity's entire philosophy of conflict resolution. Professionals are inbound. The message closed without ceremony, leaving the council to contemplate what they had truly unleashed. They had asked for deliverance from monsters, and Earth had sent bigger monsters. The professionals were coming, and they would solve the problem the only way they knew how. Council sensors registered the vessel 10 light minutes out, its angular silhouette cutting through space with geometric precision. It moved with none of the elegant curves or artful designs typical of galactic ships. Its sharp angles and flat planes suggested one purpose only: aggressive functionality. This was not a ship built for peaceful voyages or diplomatic missions. Every line spoke of calculated violence. The Vengeance approached the council station without slowing, its weapons systems remaining active throughout docking procedures. Defense protocols demanded all vessels power down offensive capabilities before entering the secure zone. Human officers ignored 17 separate automated warnings. Their ship locked onto the docking clamps with mechanical certainty, its missile batteries still tracking imaginary threats in the surrounding space. Research into human ship design revealed a disturbing pattern. Their vessels prioritized offensive capability over everything else. Weapons arrays occupied prime positions while defensive systems were minimized to essential coverage only. Their engineers treated armor and shields as necessary compromises rather than primary features. Where galactic ships were designed to survive encounters, human ships were designed to win them. Captain Hayes stepped onto the council deck without waiting for permission or invitation. Her combat boots made no sound on the polished floor, but her presence filled the chamber. She wore no ceremonial robes or diplomatic garments, only functional military fatigues with a sidearm prominently displayed. Her first words weren't greetings or formal acknowledgments. They were commands. "Show me the current Krex positions. Full sensor logs from the last engagement." She didn't request. She demanded. Council members stared at her crew as they fanned out through the chamber, tactical pads already active, weapons held in low-ready positions. They ignored the bewildered delegates completely, focusing only on threat assessment and environmental security. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Galactic diplomats spent cycles learning proper greeting rituals and cultural sensitivities. Human soldiers spent their time learning how to secure a room and identify threats. They didn't offer polite bows or ceremonial gestures. They maintained combat stances, their eyes constantly moving, their hands never far from their weapons. This arrival marked humanity's official transition from isolated species to galactic interveners. They hadn't come to negotiate or discuss. They'd come to fight, and their entire presence communicated that reality. The Council had expected rescuers who would operate within their established systems and protocols. Instead, they got professionals who followed only their own rules of engagement. Captain Hayes studied the tactical display with narrowed eyes. She pointed at a sector where Krex forces were overwhelming the last defensive line. Their pattern's obvious. "They're herding your forces into kill zones." She didn't say this with concern or sympathy. She stated it as a tactical observation, the way a mechanic might diagnose engine trouble. Her second-in-command handed her a datapad without speaking. She scanned it quickly, then looked at the council leader. "We need these coordinates cleared for orbital bombardment within the hour. Your civilian transports need to retreat to these sectors. Make it happen." She turned back to the display as if the matter were already settled. The message was delivered without ceremony, but with absolute clarity. This wasn't a diplomatic mission. It was a military intervention, and humanity would be running it their way. They hadn't come to save the galaxy out of compassion or moral obligation. They'd come to solve a problem, and their methods would be efficient, brutal, and entirely without apology. The Galactic Council begged for mercy against the Krex. But Earth didn't send diplomats or aid workers. It sent professionals. What happens when a civilization that perfected violence meets one that never learned to fight? The lights in the council chamber dimmed as the holographic display confirmed what every sensor array had already reported. The Krex Armada moved like a silent plague through 3 sectors, their trajectory set directly toward the Kepler system and its 12 billion inhabitants. Delegates from a dozen civilized species watched the red swarm advance, their many-limbed bodies frozen in postures of dread. Advanced shield technology, developed over millennia of peaceful cooperation, had proven useless. Diplomatic envoys sent to negotiate had been vaporized before they could complete their first transmission. The Krex understood only one language: annihilation. Their bioships moved with a collective intelligence that mathematical models couldn't predict, bypassing defensive grids through patterns that seemed almost biological rather than tactical. Across council worlds, evacuation orders flashed across communication networks. Civilian transports scrambled for jump points while defense forces formed protective screens that everyone knew would last minutes at best. The Velian ambassador argued for last-ditch negotiations, while the crystalline Altarians proposed scattering their people across hidden colony worlds. None of their solutions addressed the fundamental problem. They faced a predator, and they had forgotten how predators think. Decades of research showed the same pattern repeating across conquered civilizations. Peaceful species developed sophisticated technology and elegant social structures, but they consistently failed against entities operating on pure biological imperative. The Kreks didn't fight wars, they consumed. Their vessels weren't machines but living organisms that adapted to defenses in real time, learning and evolving with each engagement. Council leader Sheathul finally spoke the words they'd all been avoiding. There is one species that understands this kind of threat, one that has never abandoned the mindset of the hunter. A silence fell heavier than any they'd experienced. The very suggestion violated every principle their civilization had built across 10,000 years of peace. Their transmission contained no strategic details or tactical requests. It was a simple, desperate plea for help, directed toward a blue-green world whose violent history had made it an outcast among civilized systems. The message traveled at quantum speeds toward a species they'd spent centuries avoiding, containing a single question. Would the monsters they'd shunned become their only salvation? Earth's response did not arrive through diplomatic frequencies. It came as a military-grade transmission marked Priority Crimson, bypassing all standard communication protocols. The message header alone carried more encryption layers than the entire Council data network. Galactic archivists had long classified humanity as a volatile anomaly, a species that refused to conform to the evolutionary trend toward pacifism. Their file noted persistent cultural fascination with conflict resolution through overwhelming force rather than dialogue. Council chambers erupted into debate the moment the transmission was decoded. The Velian delegation argued that inviting one predator to combat another would only compound the catastrophe. The Altarians warned that humanity's presence might draw more aggressive species into galactic affairs. Their fear was not unfounded. Human history showed a pattern of territorial expansion, resource conflicts, and institutionalized violence on a scale no other species had ever practiced. Research into human neurobiology revealed disturbing adaptations. Their brains prioritized threat assessment and tactical planning over cooperative reasoning. MRI scans showed heightened activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and threat response, even during rest. Their evolutionary path as persistence hunters meant they could maintain combat focus for days without physiological degradation. Where other species fatigued, humans endured. This biological hardwiring for conflict made them inherently unstable in the eyes of most council members. They organized violence with the same efficiency other cultures organized agriculture or art. Their military structures showed sophistication in hierarchy, logistics, and tactical innovation that seemed disproportionate to any defensive need. Yet these same qualities presented the only possible counter to the Kreks' biological imperative. A predator that operates on instinct might be vulnerable to a predator that operates on calculation. General Stone's assessment appeared on the main display without preamble. His face showed no diplomatic courtesy, only operational clarity. He detailed Kreks' movement patterns, their consumption rates, and their apparent lack of self-preservation instincts. Then he delivered the verdict. You didn't need aid workers or negotiators, he stated, his voice flat. You needed professionals. We're sending them. The transmission ended with deployment coordinates and a list of required logistical support. There were no requests for permission, no expressions of sympathy for the civilian casualties. Only a stark surgical outline of what would happen next. The council sat in silence, confronted by the reality of their decision. They had asked for salvation, and Earth had sent soldiers, not peacekeepers, not mediators. Professionals. Kreks advanced scouts penetrated the third defense perimeter with a biological precision no mechanical system could match. Their vessels weren't constructed but grown, organic warships that regenerated damage and adapted their attack patterns in real time. Defense grids designed to counter predictable plasma weapons found themselves facing living ammunition that learned from each interception. The Kreks moved through space like a school of predatory fish, their movements too coordinated and instinctual to be disrupted by conventional tactics. These living weapons operated on a biological imperative that bypassed all known combat doctrine. Their warriors displayed no fear, no hesitation, no self-preservation instinct. Footage from fallen worlds showed Kreks ground forces advancing through killing zones that would have broken any civilized species' morale. They took horrific casualties without slowing, their only objective being forward movement toward population centers. Research teams analyzing their behavior patterns found no evidence of individual thought, only swarm intelligence, directing relentless consumption. Analysis of conquered systems revealed the Kreks' biological cycle. They didn't occupy worlds, they consumed them. Their ships landed and began breaking down local ecosystems into biomass, using the raw material to spawn new warriors and vessels. Communication intercepts showed no diplomatic channels, no demands, no negotiations, only attack vectors and consumption reports transmitting between units. The more resistance a civilization offered, the more adaptations the Kreks developed to overcome it. Colonel Brooks stood before the council observers, a tactical display glowing between them. He didn't demonstrate parade formations or ceremonial drills. He showed them how to collapse a building onto advancing troops. The holographic simulation displayed precise explosive placements along load-bearing walls, calculated to create optimal kill zones in urban environments. Galactic military attachés watched in stunned silence as he explained how to turn residential districts into death traps. The human approach to urban combat violated every convention the galaxy had established over millennia. Their soldiers trained to use the environment itself as a weapon. They practiced rerouting power grids to electrocute entire city blocks, planting explosives in sewer systems, and creating choke points where defenders could engage from multiple angles simultaneously. Their tactics showed no distinction between military and civilian infrastructure. Everything became a potential tool for killing. These methods appeared fundamentally dishonorable to species accustomed to formal battlefield engagement. Galactic warfare followed strict protocols about target selection, engagement ranges, and acceptable collateral damage. Human soldiers ignored these conventions completely. They positioned snipers in medical facilities, detonated explosives near cultural landmarks, and used psychological operations that targeted enemy morale rather than physical capabilities. Research into human military history revealed why they fought this way. Their warfare evolved through centuries of facing stronger opponents. They'd been the smaller force, the less advanced force, the force with inferior technology. Survival demanded tactics that maximized their limited advantages. They learned to fight asymmetrically, using terrain and psychology to compensate for numerical or technological disadvantages. Their entire combat doctrine developed from the position of the underdog. Human commanders prioritized mission success above all ceremonial traditions. Colonel Brooks explained it with brutal clarity. Your rules of engagement assume your opponent shares your values. The Kreks don't value honor or fairness. They value consumption. Fighting them by your rules is like bringing a knife to a gunfight and complaining it's not sporting. His words hung in the air, challenging centuries of galactic military tradition. Observers expressed horror at techniques that deliberately endangered civilian infrastructure. They argued that turning hospitals into strong points and schools into sniper nests crossed ethical boundaries. Human strategists countered that the Kreks didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets anyway. Their biological imperative drove them to consume all biomass regardless of its purpose. Preserving infrastructure was meaningless if the entire population became fuel for the enemy war machine. The fundamental disagreement came down to philosophical differences about warfare itself. Galactic species saw combat as a necessary evil to be conducted with restraint and rules. Humans saw it as a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency. Their tactical philosophy valued survival over ceremony, results over tradition. They'd learned through painful experience that fairness was a luxury you couldn't afford when facing extermination. Colonel Brooks demonstrated how human units would let Kreks forces advance into seemingly undefended areas, only to trigger coordinated attacks from concealed positions. They used terrain modification to create killing fields where the enemy's numerical advantage became meaningless. Their traps exploited Kreks' biological patterns. anticipating their movements based on consumption behavior rather than tactical logic. The lesson slowly penetrated the observer's understanding. Survival against an existential threat required abandoning comfortable conventions. You couldn't fight a hurricane with politeness or stop a plague with diplomacy. Some enemies operated outside all rules of civilized engagement, and defeating them demanded matching their commitment to absolute warfare. The humans weren't being brutal for pleasure. They were being practical for survival. Their methods worked because they reflected reality rather than idealism. The Kreks wouldn't pause to admire honorable combat or respect cultural landmarks. They would consume everything and everyone regardless of rules or traditions. Fighting them required embracing uncomfortable truths about violence and survival. The galaxy had to choose between comfortable principles and continued existence. Human commanders put it bluntly: fairness gets entire species exterminated. Effectiveness keeps them alive. The choice wasn't between honor and dishonor, it was between life and death. Their tactics might violate every convention galactic civilizations held dear, but they produced results where traditional methods had failed completely. Sometimes survival requires doing what works, not what feels proper. The observers left the briefing with changed perspectives. They'd seen warfare not as a contest of values, but as a mathematical problem of survival probabilities. Human methods might be brutal, but they were also effective. Against an enemy that offered no mercy, asked for no quarter, and understood only consumption, maybe brutality was the only language that would work. The lesson was harsh but necessary. When facing annihilation, you fight to win, not to feel good about how you fought. Dr. Martinez stood before the holographic display, her pointer tapping twice against the Kreks' evolutionary timeline. They never had to develop strategy, she stated, her voice carrying through the silent council chamber. Their world presented no significant challenges beyond basic survival. They evolved as apex predators in an environment that demanded nothing more than brute force and relentless aggression. The display showed Kreks' hunting patterns: straight-line assaults, overwhelming numbers, consumption-driven movements with no tactical variation. The Kreks operated on pure biological instinct. Their neural mapping showed minimal higher cognitive functions beyond threat identification and consumption patterns. They'd never encountered opponents who treated violence as a mathematical discipline rather than a biological imperative. Their entire evolutionary history consisted of dominating lesser species through sheer power, never facing creatures that could outthink rather than outfight them. Human development presented the exact opposite evolutionary path. Originating from what galactic classifiers called a Class 12 death world, humans faced constant environmental pressures that demanded adaptability. Ice ages, massive storms, and lethal predators forced them to develop persistence hunting techniques. They learned to track prey for days, studying patterns, anticipating movements, and exploiting weaknesses through observation and planning. Research indicated predator species often failed when confronted with unpredictable resistance. Their instinct-driven attacks assumed predictable responses from prey. Humans violated these expectations systematically. Neural scans showed enhanced activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and tactical adaptation. Where Kreks' brains prioritized consumption signals, human brains prioritized threat assessment and strategic planning. This created a fundamental mismatch in combat philosophy. The Kreks fought with biological certainty, their movements dictated by millions of years of evolutionary programming. Humans fought with calculated flexibility, their tactics evolving in real time based on observed patterns. One side operated on instinct, the other on analysis. One followed genetic programming, the other wrote new code for each engagement. The battlefield became a laboratory for testing evolutionary theories. Human units didn't engage the Kreks directly at first. They observed, recorded, and analyzed. They mapped movement patterns, identified response triggers, and developed predictive models of Kreks' behavior. Their approach resembled scientists studying animal behavior more than soldiers fighting a war. They collected data before applying force. Kreks' forces continued their instinctive advances, unaware they were being studied rather than resisted. They broke through defensive lines that humans had deliberately weakened to observe their penetration patterns. They consumed bait positions designed to test their consumption priorities. Every engagement provided more data for the human tactical networks. Dr. Martinez highlighted the neural contrast on her display. Krek's brain activity showed steady, repetitive patterns during combat. Human neural scans displayed constant fluctuation, assessment, adaptation, innovation. One brain followed pre-programmed instructions. The other wrote new instructions based on changing conditions. This difference would prove more decisive than any weapon system. The question wasn't whether humans could defeat the Kreks in straightforward combat. The question was whether instinct could outperform calculation, when calculation understood instinct better than instinct understood itself. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to overcome stronger, faster predators through intelligence and adaptation. The Kreks had spent theirs dominating weaker creatures through force alone. This confrontation would test whether evolution favored brute strength or strategic thinking when both reached their logical extremes. The Kreks represented perfection in biological dominance. Humans represented perfection in adaptive violence. One side had never lost a fight against inferior opponents. The other had never accepted that any opponent was truly superior. The laboratory was prepared. The specimens were behaving predictably. The scientists were ready to begin their experimentation. The transport ships settled into the crimson dust of Kepler's northern hemisphere, their ramps lowering before the landing gear had fully stabilized. 50,000 human veterans moved out not as an invading force but as military engineers assessing a construction site. They ignored the pre-established defensive perimeters the local forces had prepared. Those were designed to delay, not destroy. Instead, they began reshaping the terrain itself into a series of interlocking kill zones. Layered defensive positions appeared across the landscape. Engineers repurposed civilian infrastructure with terrifying efficiency. Communication towers became sniper nests. Power conduits were rewired into electromagnetic traps, and drainage systems were packed with high explosives. The very evacuation routes that civilian authorities had established were carefully reworked into funneling systems that would guide the Kreks into prepared engagement areas. What the locals saw as humanitarian corridors, human strategists saw as natural choke points. Research from centuries of terrestrial warfare supported their approach. Environmental modification multiplied combat effectiveness against numerically superior forces by a factor of 7. Human units demonstrated near-instant adaptation to Kepler's varied combat zones. In the crystalline cities, they used the reflective surfaces to create blinding light traps. In the dense forests, they turned the vegetation into natural ambush points. Desert regions became killing fields where the Kreks' thermal signatures stood out against the cool sand. Their objective wasn't to hold territory in the traditional sense. They fought to systematically erase Kreks' combat capability. Each engagement was designed to destroy more of the enemy than they could replace through their biological reproduction cycle. They targeted not just warriors but the support organisms that maintained their combat effectiveness. The humans understood something the galactic forces had missed. You don't defeat a biological threat by fighting its symptoms. You attack its ability to sustain itself. The planet itself became an extension of human tactical thinking. Geological surveys identified natural choke points that could be enhanced with minimal engineering. Atmospheric conditions were analyzed for potential weaponization. Dust storms could conceal movements. Thermal inversions could trap chemical agents. Even the planet's magnetic field was mapped for potential disruption of Krek's biological communications. Civilian structures were evaluated not for their cultural value but for their tactical potential. A hospital's sturdy construction made it an ideal strongpoint. A school's open courtyards became perfect killing zones. A manufacturing facility's power generation could be diverted to electrify perimeter fences. The humans saw Kepler not as a world to be defended but as a resource to be utilized. Their approach was geometric, calculating, and utterly without sentiment. This transformation occurred within 3 planetary rotations. By the time Krek scouts reached the outer observation posts, Kepler had been completely remade into a weapon. The gently curving architecture that had symbolized peaceful advancement now concealed firing positions. The beautiful crystal gardens hid pressure-sensitive explosives. The efficient transportation network had become a web of death traps. The humans had turned the Kreks' own biological imperative against them. Their predictable consumption patterns would lead them directly into carefully prepared ambushes. The local population watched in mixed horror and awe as their world was systematically weaponized. They'd expected defenders who would stand brave lines against the enemy. Instead, They got engineers who treated their entire civilization as raw material for constructing a massive death machine. The lesson was uncomfortable but necessary. Sometimes survival requires sacrificing what you built for peace to win the war that threatens it. Kepler's transformation represented the brutal practicality of human warfare. When facing extinction, everything becomes a weapon. War Alpha Gorthak moved through the silent city streets with his elite guard, their bioarmor clicking softly against the polished stone. He expected to find defensive formations, honorable stands, the glorious combat his species had perfected across countless conquests. Instead, he found empty plazas and abandoned structures that should have been defended to the last warrior. His tactical sense recognized something was wrong, but his biological programming couldn't compute what exactly. The first trap activated not with a frontal assault, but with the ground collapsing beneath his rear guard. Stabilized soil gave way to precisely placed sinkholes that swallowed 3 warriors before they could react. Gorthak roared a challenge, expecting opponents to reveal themselves for honorable combat. Instead, energy conduits along the buildings redirected power into the wet streets, electrifying the standing water around his forces. Corporal Clark didn't engage with ceremonial challenge or individual prowess. From a concealed position 3 blocks away, he coordinated overlapping fields of fire that struck the Krex formation from 7 different angles simultaneously. Sniper rounds targeted joint articulation points in their bioarmor. Grenades landed not to kill but to separate and disorient. The human fighters utilized team coordination and technological superiority, rather than individual combat skills. Research into predator behavior showed this exact pattern. Species accustomed to ritualized combat become disoriented when their expected patterns are violated. The Krex knew how to respond to frontal assaults and defensive stands. They didn't understand opponents who refused to engage directly, who turned the environment itself into a weapon, who fought not to prove superiority but to achieve objectives. Gorthak found himself isolated from his guard, cut off by collapsing architecture and precisely timed explosions. He expected his opponents to emerge and claim their victory through personal combat. Instead, he found himself targeted by non-lethal immobilizing rounds that adhered to his armor and began hardening into restraint fields. His magnificent biological weapons became useless against enemies who wouldn't approach within reach. The War Alpha finally understood the fundamental difference as the restraint fields completed their hardening process. Humans didn't measure victory by honor or glorious combat. They measured it by survival and mission completion. Their entire approach to warfare was pragmatic rather than ceremonial. They fought to win, not to prove their combat superiority. This realization shattered his confidence more completely than any military defeat could have. The confrontation ended without a single warrior facing him directly. Automated systems completed his capture, while human soldiers maintained their positions. They didn't approach to gloat or claim trophies. They simply secured the area and moved to the next objective. Their efficiency was more terrifying than any display of martial prowess could have been. Gorthak had faced countless species across multiple star systems. He'd defeated civilizations with superior technology and greater numbers, but he'd never encountered an enemy that treated warfare as an engineering problem, rather than a test of strength. The humans had demonstrated that combat wasn't about honor or glory. It was about applying maximum force with minimum risk to achieve objectives. The lesson was simple and brutal. Humans fight to win. They don't care about ceremony, tradition, or honor. They care about results. This philosophical difference made them more dangerous than any opponent the Krex had ever faced. They weren't just another predator species, they were practitioners of violence as a science, and they'd just demonstrated their mastery. Admiral Thompson's fleet emerged from jump space with geometric precision, their angular warships forming a perfect sphere around the Kepler system. Unlike the Krex's chaotic biological swarm, the human vessels moved with mechanical certainty. Their positions calculated to maximize firing solutions while minimizing exposure. Sensor arrays immediately prioritized targets among the Krex bioships, identifying critical biological systems rather than aiming for total destruction. The ultimatum transmission required no translation matrix. It broadcast on all frequencies in simple declarative terms. Immediate surrender or total destruction. No negotiations, no conditions, no discussions. The message repeated twice with no variation in tone or content. This wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of physical law. Human targeting systems demonstrated capabilities the galaxy had never witnessed. Their weapons fired specialized rounds designed to disrupt organic functions without structural damage. Krex bioships drifted helplessly as their neural networks shut down. Their weapon systems fell silent. Their propulsion systems ceased functioning. The humans weren't destroying the enemy. They were systematically disabling them with surgical precision. Research into human military technology revealed their unique approach to biological targeting. Their weapons could neutralize threats while preserving intelligence assets and minimizing collateral damage. This represented a complete inversion of traditional galactic warfare principles. Where others sought to destroy, humans sought to incapacitate. Where others caused maximum damage, humans achieved maximum effect with minimal waste. The Krex had never received demands in their entire evolutionary history. They were the ones who gave ultimatums, who set terms, who decided who lived and died. Their communication systems showed confusion patterns, their biological networks struggling to process the concept of surrender. They had no protocols for receiving demands, no biological programming for compliance. Their refusal came not as a transmitted response, but as continued aggressive movements. 3 bioships attempted to break through the containment sphere. The human response was immediate and methodical. Targeting systems identified their propulsion clusters, their weapon organs, their command nodes. Each ship was disabled with exactly the required force, no more, no less. They drifted powerless, their biological systems neutralized but their structural integrity maintained. This demonstration of controlled force represented a new warfare paradigm. The humans weren't fighting to exterminate but to dominate. Their approach showed understanding of biological systems that surpassed even the Krex's own comprehension. They targeted the exact neural pathways that controlled aggression, the specific organic components that enabled combat functions, the precise biological mechanisms that allowed adaptation. The message was clear through action rather than words. Surrender was acceptable and would be met with restraint. Resistance would be met with systematic dismantling of military capability. The humans offered 2 choices: peaceful submission or controlled disablement. There was no third option for glorious combat or honorable defeat. Their warfare had evolved beyond destruction into something more precise and more terrifying. Admiral Thompson's fleet maintained formation, their weapons tracking every Krex vessel simultaneously. They didn't need to destroy the entire armada. They only needed to demonstrate they could disable any ship that moved against them. The ultimatum stood unchanged, its simplicity more frightening than any complex set of demands. The Krex faced opponents who understood biological warfare better than they did, who fought with precision rather than rage, who offered surrender not as mercy but as efficiency. This represented the complete evolution of galactic conflict. Warfare wasn't about strength against strength anymore. It was about understanding against instinct, precision against force, control against chaos. The humans had brought a new kind of battle to the stars, one where the victor didn't need to destroy to win, only to demonstrate they could destroy everything if necessary. The lesson was clear through the drifting, disabled bioships. Resistance is eliminated, but surrender is always an option. Dr. Martinez stood before the Council's holographic display, her expression neutral as she cycled through neural activity scans of captured Krex warriors. The Council chamber remained tense, many delegates viewing the images with undisguised revulsion. They saw biological weapons that should have been dismantled, not studied. The concept of rehabilitating what they considered tiansheng de liu Shuja struck them as dangerously naive. The rehabilitation program operated on a simple but radical principle. Aggression could be redirected, not eliminated. Captured Krex underwent neural reprogramming that targeted specific behavioral pathways. Their biological advantages, enhanced strength, rapid healing, swarm coordination, weren't removed but rather channeled toward protective functions. The program used reward systems that linked positive reinforcement to defensive behaviors rather than destructive ones. Many Council species argued forcefully for execution. They saw the Krex as inherently violent, their predatory nature written into their genetic code. The Velian delegation cited historical examples of predator species that could never be trusted around peaceful civilizations. The Altarians warned that attempting to reform such beings would only lead to future betrayals and casualties. Dr. Martinez presented the data without emotional appeal. She showed how Krek's neural patterns changed during conditioning. Their aggressive impulses didn't disappear, but were gradually associated with protective actions. Warriors who once sought to consume now positioned themselves defensively when sensing threats. Their biological imperative to attack was being rewired into an imperative to guard. Research from Earth's own history supported this approach. Predatory behavior had been successfully redirected in numerous species through proper psychological intervention. The key was understanding that aggression wasn't the problem, direction was. A Krek's warrior's strength made them terrifying predators, but that same strength could make them exceptional guardians if properly channeled. Former Krek's warriors began demonstrating protective behaviors that shocked observers. Footage showed a group of rehabilitated Kreks forming a defensive perimeter around a Velian settlement during a minor asteroid impact event. Their coordinated movements and instinctive protective stances mirrored their previous attack patterns, but with completely different objectives. They weren't fighting against something, they were protecting something. This represented a fundamental shift in dealing with violent species. The galactic standard had always been containment or elimination. Humanity introduced a third option, transformation. They treated violence not as an inherent evil, but as a potential energy source that could be harnessed for different purposes. The same biological drives that made the Kreks effective destroyers could make them effective protectors. The program's success challenged centuries of galactic biological theory. Species weren't permanently defined by their evolutionary history. Behavioral conditioning could override millions of years of predatory programming. The Kreks weren't becoming pacifists, they were becoming protectors. Their aggression remained, but its application changed completely. Dr. Martinez concluded her presentation with before and after footage of the same Krek's warriors. The before showed them tearing through defensive positions with single-minded destruction. The after showed them carefully maneuvering civilian transports through hazardous space, their movements precise and protective. The physical capabilities were identical, only the purpose had changed. The data proved even the most violent beings could be reformed with the right approach. It wasn't about eliminating what made them dangerous, but about giving that danger a new direction. The Kreks' biological advantages made them ideal guardians once their aggression was properly focused. They became living proof that redemption was possible through understanding, rather than destruction. The statistics appeared on the council display with clinical precision. 87% of Kreks participants completed rehabilitation within 2 cycles. The number hung in the air, challenging centuries of galactic biological determinism. Skeptical delegates studied the data, their antennae twitching with discomfort. They questioned whether former predators could truly transition from destroyers to defenders. The concept violated their understanding of evolutionary programming. The rehabilitation process used structured exposure therapy combined with combat training. Krek's warriors spent increasing time among peaceful civilizations, while simultaneously drilling against simulated threats. This dual approach created new neural pathways linking aggressive impulses to protective behaviors. Their biological drives remained intact, but found new outlets through carefully designed conditioning protocols. Research from multiple species supported the methodology. Learned behavior could override genetic predisposition when applied systematically. The Kreks weren't being made passive, they were being redirected. Their enhanced strength, rapid reflexes, and swarm coordination became assets for defense rather than tools for consumption. The same biological advantages that made them terrifying invaders made them exceptional guardians. Neural scans showed measurable changes in aggression markers. Activity in regions associated with predatory behavior decreased by 63%. Protective neural patterns showed 78% increase after conditioning. The data indicated fundamental restructuring of behavioral responses, not superficial compliance. The Kreks weren't pretending to change. Their brains were physically adapting to new patterns. Their integration provided practical benefits beyond symbolic redemption. Former Kreks warriors joined system defense forces, their biological advantages complementing technological capabilities. They could operate in environments that would kill other species, endure combat stress that would break civilized soldiers, and coordinate with precision that mechanical systems couldn't match. They became living weapons redirected toward protection. The program's success challenged deep-seated prejudices across the galaxy. Species that had advocated for complete extermination now faced undeniable evidence that reformation worked better than destruction. The 87% success rate represented thousands of beings who had transitioned from threats to protectors. Each successful integration saved resources that would have been spent on containment or elimination. Dr. Martinez presented follow-up studies showing long-term stability. Rehabilitated Kreks maintained their new behavioral patterns through multiple cycles without regression incidents. Their performance in defensive roles exceeded expectations, with 94% effectiveness ratings in simulated threat scenarios. The data built an increasingly compelling case for rehabilitation over traditional approaches. Council members who had opposed the program found themselves examining their assumptions. The numbers provided objective evidence that couldn't be dismissed as humanitarian idealism. This was practical effectiveness demonstrated through measurable outcomes. The rehabilitation program wasn't about forgiveness. It was about utilizing available resources efficiently. The final assessment compared costs between rehabilitation and traditional methods. Retraining Kreks warriors required 30% less resources than building equivalent defensive capabilities through technology. Maintenance costs showed 45% reduction compared to permanent containment facilities. The economic argument complemented the ethical one, creating a compelling case for change. 87% represented more than a success rate. It represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy approached violent species. The data proved that redemption wasn't just possible, it was practical. Extermination wasted biological resources and required constant vigilance. Rehabilitation created new assets while eliminating threats. The numbers didn't just suggest an alternative, they proved it worked better. The Galactic Defense Academy rose from Earth's western plateau, its architecture reflecting its purpose: angular, functional, and devoid of decorative elements. Here, cadets from hundreds of species trained together, their diverse forms moving through combat simulations and ethics seminars. The institution's philosophy rejected the galactic tradition of viewing violence as an inherent evil. Instead, it taught violence as a tool, dangerous but necessary, like fire or radiation, something to be mastered rather than feared. Students from peaceful civilizations struggled with this concept. A Velian cadet might freeze during live fire exercises, her cultural programming screaming that all violence was wrong. An Altarian might question the morality of preemptive strikes against identified threats. They had to unlearn generations of pacifist conditioning to grasp a difficult truth. Sometimes preserving creation requires mastering destruction. The Academy didn't teach them to love violence. It taught them to control it. The motto stood engraved above the main entrance in simple, unadorned lettering: "We are the violence, so they don't have to be." These words represented humanity's reluctant acceptance of their role in the new galactic order. They had become the bearers of necessary force, the practitioners of controlled aggression who would stand between civilization and chaos. It was a burden they hadn't sought but couldn't refuse. Research supported this concentrated approach. Societies that specialized military capabilities showed lower overall violence rates. By training professional defenders, the galaxy could allow most species to maintain their peaceful cultures without developing warrior classes or military infrastructures. The violence wasn't eliminated, it was contained within trained professionals who understood its ethical application. Cadets learned that true strength lay in restraint as much as in force. They studied scenarios where doing nothing caused more harm than measured action. They analyzed historical conflicts where excessive force created new enemies, while precise application ended threats. The curriculum emphasized that power without control was just destruction, but controlled power could be protection. The inscription's words echoed through the command center during quiet moments. They served as both warning and affirmation for those who chose this difficult path. The message acknowledged the pain while justifying the purpose. It recognized that some must embrace violence so others may reject it, that some must stand guard so others may sleep peacefully. The final line captured humanity's entire journey in one simple statement. It defined their role not as conquerors but as guardians, not as masters but as protectors. This distinction made all the difference in how the galaxy viewed their transformation, from isolated species to cosmic interveners. The wall stood as permanent evidence that their violence served protection, not domination. They went to the stars not as conquerors, but as guardians. The signing chamber held representatives from hundreds of species. Their diverse forms arranged around the central display where the Galactic Defense Charter glowed with solemn authority. This document established binding rules for collective security while imposing strict limits on offensive warfare. It represented the institutionalization of everything learned from the Krex conflict, the hard lessons about preparedness, cooperation, and the necessary balance between force and restraint. Some species voiced concerns about concentrating military power within a unified structure. The Velians feared losing their autonomy to a centralized command, while the crystalline Altarians worried about proportional response protocols. Their hesitation reflected the natural tension between planetary sovereignty and collective security. They'd witnessed how uncoordinated defense had nearly doomed the galaxy, but surrendering control still felt dangerous. The Charter addressed these concerns through carefully structured provisions. It guaranteed planetary autonomy over internal affairs while establishing clear protocols for coordinated defensive response. Member species retained control of their own forces except during designated threat scenarios. The agreement created a framework where assistance was mandatory when requested, but interference was prohibited without consent. Research into successful defense alliances showed that clear rules and shared values formed the foundation of lasting cooperation. The Charter incorporated human strategic principles: swift response, overwhelming force when necessary, minimal collateral damage, while adapting them to galactic ethical standards. It represented a fusion of human practicality with alien perspectives on preservation and proportionality. Human delegates worked closely with other species to ensure the document reflected universal principles rather than imposing Terran values. They incorporated Altarian precision in threat assessment, Velian cultural protection protocols, and even Krex input on biological warfare countermeasures. The final charter became a truly galactic document, blending the best insights from multiple civilizations. The signing ceremony occurred in the same chamber where the original plea for help had been transmitted. Representatives approached the display one by one, adding their species' approval to the historic agreement. There were no grand speeches or celebrations, only the quiet acknowledgement of necessary change. Each signature represented acceptance of a new reality about galactic security. The Charter ensured no species would face existential threats alone ever again. It established rapid response networks, shared intelligence systems, and mutual defense obligations. Member worlds gained access to Terran military training, Krex rehabilitation programs, and combined fleet protection. The agreement transformed isolated civilizations into a unified defensive front. This formalization of galactic protection represented the culmination of humanity's journey from outsiders to guardians. The Charter codified their hard-won understanding that strength required wisdom, that protection demanded responsibility, and that true security came through cooperation rather than isolation. It turned individual lessons into institutional knowledge. The signed document activated immediately, its protocols integrating with defense networks across member worlds. Monitoring systems came online, communication channels established priority links, and response forces received updated deployment authorities. The galaxy now operated with a coordinated defensive framework that had been absent during the Krex crisis. This moment marked the beginning of a new galactic era, one where protection became a shared responsibility rather than an individual burden. The Charter didn't promise perfect safety, but it guaranteed that future threats would face a united front. It represented the galaxy's collective decision to learn from near disaster and build something stronger from the lessons. The signing completed the transformation that began with a desperate plea for help. Where once there had been isolated civilizations vulnerable to predation, now stood a coordinated alliance capable of defending itself. The Charter provided the structure, the protocols, and the commitment necessary to prevent another Krex situation from developing. It turned reactive fear into proactive security. As the final signature registered, defense networks across hundreds of worlds synchronized for the first time. The soft hum of activating systems filled the chamber, a tangible manifestation of the new galactic reality. Protection was no longer optional or theoretical. It was institutionalized, operational, and permanent. The galaxy had finally formalized its understanding that strength lay in unity. The formation shifted, its impossible geometry materializing against the starfield. Krek's bioships pulsed with organic light beside human angular warships, their sharp edges contrasting with the Altarians' crystalline cruisers. This was not a temporary alliance but a permanent operational integration. The combined fleet demonstrated how diversity became strength when properly coordinated. Different designs, different species, different technologies now moved as one defensive entity. Joint exercises revealed how each ship type compensated for the other's weaknesses. Krek's vessels provided biological adaptability and regenerative capabilities. Human warships delivered precise firepower and tactical flexibility. Altarian craft offered advanced sensor arrays and communication networks. They covered each other's vulnerabilities while amplifying their combined effectiveness. The whole became far more than the sum of its parts. Old rivals operated together despite profound differences. Krek's pilots followed human tactical commands without hesitation. Altarian navigators calculated jump coordinates for biological ships they once feared. The transition required overcoming centuries of distrust and biological incompatibility. Training simulations forced them to depend on each other's unique capabilities for survival. Research confirmed what the exercises demonstrated. Diverse military forces adapted 37% faster to unpredictable threats than homogeneous fleets. Mixed species crews solved tactical problems with greater creativity and flexibility. The variation in perspectives and capabilities created a more resilient fighting force. Standardized fleets had predictable responses. Combined fleets had adaptive solutions. The common insignia appeared on every hull, a star surrounded by a circle. It represented unity without demanding uniformity. Each species maintained its identity while committing to shared protection. The symbol reminded them that different approaches could serve the same purpose. It became a visual promise that no civilization would face threats alone again. This operational integration proved the rehabilitation program's success beyond statistical measures. Former predators now protected those they once hunted. Biological enemies coordinated maneuvers with mechanical precision. The fleet became living proof that transformation was possible when guided by understanding rather than destruction. What began as desperate necessity evolved into strategic advantage. The mixed fleet represented the galaxy's transformation from prey to protector. Where once isolated civilizations fell to superior forces, now combined strength offered collective security. This visible symbol moved through contested sectors not as conquerors but as guardians. Their presence communicated that the galaxy would defend itself as a united front. Captain Rogers watched his mixed squadron execute a complex maneuver. Human pilots flew cover for Krek's bioships while Altarian cruisers provided sensor overwatch. They moved with coordination that seemed impossible months earlier. His crew represented the new reality. Beings who were once prey had become protectors. Their collaboration demonstrated the practical application of the new defensive philosophy. The galaxy had operationalized its hard-won wisdom through this combined force. Protection became a shared responsibility exercised through coordinated action. Different species brought different strengths to common defense. The fleet served as both weapon and symbol, a demonstration that unity could emerge from diversity when guided by common purpose. This approach allowed peaceful species to thrive without compromising their values. The Velians continued their artistic traditions, the Altarians their scientific research, the crystalline beings their architectural wonders. They could create beauty because others stood watch against destruction. Their cultures remained intact because someone else handled the ugly necessities of defense. The Academy became the galaxy's central hub for ethical warfare development. Strategists from multiple species collaborated on defensive doctrines that balanced effectiveness with moral considerations. They established rules of engagement that allowed maximum protection with minimum collateral damage. The institution wasn't just training soldiers. It was developing a new galactic standard for responsible force. The motto's painful truth reflected the galaxy's hard-earned wisdom. Peace wasn't the absence of violence, but the presence of controlled ethical force applied by professionals. Those professionals carried the moral burden so others could live without it. They became the necessary opposition to chaos, the calculated response to threat, the violence that prevented greater violence. Cadets graduated, understanding their role wasn't glorious or heroic. It was necessary, They weren't warriors in the traditional sense, but guardians who understood violence well enough to control it. Their training ensured they would wield force with precision and regret, never with enthusiasm or cruelty. They learned to be the shield so others could remain the heart. The Terran Defense Corps insignia gleamed against Gorthak's bioarmor, its angular lines contrasting with the organic curves of his natural plating. His rehabilitation had taken nearly twice as long as other Krex warriors. Where most required neural reprogramming for basic behavioral changes, his conditioning as War Alpha ran to the core of his biological programming. The very instincts that made him an effective leader now made him resistant to change. Specialists developed custom protocols that took his unique psychology into account. Many council species still reacted with visible tension when he entered a room. Their fear wasn't irrational. It was rooted in generations of Krex predation across multiple star systems. Their distrust lingered despite his proven loyalty and consistent performance. He understood their hesitation. Changing minds required more time than changing neural pathways. His presence remained a test of the galaxy's commitment to its new principles. He commanded mixed species units that combined Krex biological advantages with human strategic doctrine. His warriors provided the physical strength and swarm coordination, while human officers handled tactical planning and technological integration. This combination proved exceptionally effective during training exercises. Krex endurance allowed for extended operations where other species would fatigue. Their biological communication systems provided secure channels that couldn't be intercepted through conventional means. Research indicated that reformed leaders often became the most effective instructors for similar beings. Gorthak's personal experience with human tactics gave him unique insight into both Krex psychology and Terran strategy. He understood how his former forces thought and how human commanders would counter them. This dual perspective made him invaluable for developing defensive measures against potential future threats. His journey mirrored the galaxy's broader transformation. Where once he led forces dedicated to consumption, he now directed units focused on protection. The same biological drives that made him an effective predator now made him an exceptional guardian. His transformation proved that purpose could be redirected without eliminating fundamental capabilities. Change wasn't about becoming something different, but about becoming something more. He became living evidence that even the most violent beings could adapt with proper guidance. His commission as general represented the Terran Defense Corps' commitment to its own principles. They didn't just preach redemption, they practiced it at the highest levels. His position demonstrated that transformation wasn't limited to foot soldiers, but extended to leadership roles. His story inspired others across the galaxy. Former Krex warriors saw his advancement as proof that change brought opportunity, rather than punishment. Peaceful species witnessed his consistent performance as evidence that rehabilitation could produce reliable results. Even skeptical council members gradually accepted that the program's success wasn't theoretical but demonstrated through practical application. General Gorthak's office contained both Krex tactical displays and Terran strategic manuals. He studied human military history with the same intensity he'd once studied conquest patterns. His understanding of Terran tactics grew with each simulation and exercise. He could now anticipate human responses almost as well as Krex biological impulses. His mixed species units became models for integrated operations. Krex warriors worked alongside Velian technicians and Altarian strategists. They developed new combat doctrines that leveraged each species' strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. These units consistently outperformed homogeneous formations in readiness evaluations. The general's presence at strategy sessions changed the nature of planning. He could identify Krex-style tactics that other officers might miss. His insights helped develop countermeasures for biological warfare patterns that purely technological approaches overlooked. His value extended beyond symbolic representation into practical military effectiveness. His transformation answered the question of how a former War Alpha could become a Terran general. The path required accepting new purposes while utilizing existing capabilities. It demanded understanding different combat philosophies without abandoning proven effectiveness. Most importantly, it demonstrated that change was possible when guided by those who understood both what was and what could be. The memorial wall stood in Earth's primary defense hub, its dark surface etched with names that stretched across 3 full panels. Each name represented a life lost during the Kepler campaign and subsequent operations. The wall wasn't hidden away in some somber memorial hall, but placed directly in the main command center, where strategic decisions were made daily. Its presence served as a constant reminder that every tactical choice carried human costs. The inscription above the names captured humanity's complex relationship with violence and protection. It acknowledged the terrible price of peace while affirming the absolute necessity of their role. The words weren't heroic or triumphant. They were sober and direct, reflecting the weight of responsibility that came with being guardians rather than conquerors. This physical manifestation of sacrifice helped other species understand what protection truly cost. Research across military organizations showed memorials helped maintain perspective on missions and morality. The wall reminded strategists that behind every deployment order were beings who might not return. It prevented the abstraction of warfare into mere tactical simulations or resource calculations. Commanders making difficult decisions could look at those names and remember the human element behind every operation. The inscription reflected humanity's reluctant acceptance of their violent expertise for the greater good. They hadn't sought this role but had embraced it when called upon. The words acknowledged that sometimes protecting life required taking life, a paradox that peaceful civilizations struggled to accept. The memorial helped bridge that understanding gap by showing the personal costs of that protection. Pilgrims from across the galaxy came to see the wall and understand humanity's transformation. Felian artists studied the names while Altarian scientists analyzed the wall's psychological impact on decision-making. Even former Krex warriors visited, their bioarmor clicking softly as they moved before the etched names. The memorial became a site for contemplating the galaxy's painful transformation from prey to protector. The wall's design was intentionally simple: no grand architecture, no heroic statues, no victory celebrations. Just names and dates arranged chronologically from the first losses to the most recent. This simplicity emphasized that each life mattered equally, from the lowest-ranking technician to the highest-ranking officer. The memorial treated sacrifice as universal rather than hierarchical. Command personnel often paused before major operations to read sections of the wall. This ritual helped ground their planning in reality rather than abstraction. They remembered that each deployment order would potentially add names to that surface. This constant awareness influenced their tactical choices, encouraging strategies that minimized casualties while achieving objectives. The memorial also served as an educational tool for new cadets at the Galactic Defense Academy. Instructors brought them to see the wall during their ethics training. They discussed specific names and the missions where those individuals fell. This made theoretical concepts about the costs of protection tangible and immediate. Cadets understood they weren't just learning combat tactics. They were learning how to wield violence responsibly. Visiting diplomats from peaceful species often experienced profound realizations at the wall. They saw proof that humanity's military actions came with deep personal sacrifice. This helped overcome lingering distrust about human motivations. The names demonstrated that Earth hadn't intervened for conquest or glory, but because someone had to bear the terrible burden of protection. This represented the future of galactic security. Not standardized fleets imposing uniformity, but combined forces leveraging diversity, not isolated civilizations defending alone, but coordinated networks responding together. The mixed fleet proved that strength came from integration rather than assimilation. They protected the galaxy not by making everything the same, but by making differences work together. Dr. Elena Martinez stood before the assembled council one final time, her data slate glowing with the accumulated evidence of their collective transformation. Her report framed the galaxy's entire journey not as a descent into violence, but as an awakening to ethical responsibility. She presented controlled force not as a necessary evil, but as a tool requiring mastery and moral understanding. This perspective challenged the fundamental assumptions that had nearly doomed their civilization. Some species still visibly struggled with this philosophical shift. The Velian delegation shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their antennae twitching with unease. The Altarian representatives maintained their crystalline composure, but emitted subtle frequency variations indicating distress. Accepting violence as sometimes necessary felt like betraying generations of pacifist tradition. Their discomfort reflected the growing pains of galactic maturity. Her research demonstrated a counterintuitive truth. Denying violent capabilities didn't create safety, It created vulnerability. Civilizations that refused to acknowledge the potential for violence became perfect targets for those who embraced it. The Krex conflict provided tragic proof that ideals offered no protection against entities that operated outside ethical frameworks. Preparedness required understanding violence, not ignoring it. The data showed clear patterns across multiple scenarios. Controlled ethical violence consistently prevented uncontrolled destructive violence. Professional military forces following strict rules of engagement caused 90% fewer civilian casualties than irregular forces or uncontrolled predators. Regulation produced better outcomes than prohibition. This evidence challenged the notion that all violence was equally wrong. This philosophical shift represented the galaxy's maturation in understanding real security. Protection wasn't the absence of threat, but the presence of competent response. Peace wasn't the elimination of conflict, but the management of it through established systems and trained professionals. They were learning to think in practical terms rather than idealistic absolutes. Dr. Martinez emphasized that choices and teachers mattered more than inherent nature. The Krex rehabilitation program proved that behavior could be redirected through proper guidance. The same biological drives that made them effective destroyers made them exceptional protectors when properly channeled. This understanding transformed how the galaxy approached potentially threatening species. Her report became the foundational text for the new galactic defense philosophy. Military academies incorporated its principles into their core curriculum. Commanders referenced its findings when making engagement decisions. The document provided the ethical framework that allowed force to be applied responsibly, rather than avoided entirely. It gave permission to protect while maintaining moral boundaries. The ethical framework balanced several key principles. Proportional response ensured force matched threat levels. Minimal collateral damage protected non-combatants. Continuous evaluation required reassessing tactics based on effectiveness and consequences. These guidelines prevented the slide into unrestrained violence, while allowing necessary defensive actions. This approach acknowledged that strength without wisdom destroys. Uncontrolled force caused unnecessary suffering and created new enemies. But strength with wisdom protects. Measured, intelligent application of power could prevent greater harm and maintain stability. The difference lay in how force was applied, not whether it was applied. The lesson extended beyond military applications. It influenced how the galaxy approached conflict resolution at all levels. Disputes between species now included risk assessment and contingency planning, alongside negotiation. They learned to prepare for failure while hoping for success. This pragmatic approach recognized that sometimes dialogue fails and alternatives must be available. Dr. Martinez concluded with a simple statement that captured their hard-won wisdom. The galaxy had learned that true peace required understanding violence rather than denying it. Protection demanded responsibility rather than avoidance. Their survival depended on accepting that some tools, however dangerous, must be mastered rather than abandoned. The ethical application of force had become their shield against chaos. The galaxy learned through brutal experience that mercy requires strength to be meaningful. Earth's transformation from pariah to guardian revealed the uncomfortable truth about peace. It isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of capable protectors. True guardianship rests not in fighting others' battles for them, but in teaching them to defend themselves. The strong must bear the burden of violence so the peaceful can remain so. Humanity became the shield, not the sword, ensuring that defense, not domination, defined the new galactic order. Strength guided by wisdom became the foundation of lasting safety.